The world of Aurelia was not built of brick and mortar, but of silence and gold. It was a cathedral consecrated to power, where the air itself seemed filtered through wealth, carrying the faint, layered sense of old money, expensive leather, and the earthy perfume of truffles flown in that morning from Piedmont. Light did not simply illuminate the room. It dripped from colossal crystal chandeliers, casting a warm, honeyed glow that made every surface gleam with a reserved opulence. The tables, islands of crisp white linen, were spaced so far apart that conversations became private confessions, shielded by the vast, plush expanse of a Persian rug that swallowed sound whole. The only permissible noises were the delicate, rhythmic clinking of silver against porcelain, and the near-inaudible murmur of billion-dollar deals being sealed over glasses of vintage Bordeaux. Here, fortunes were made and unmade with a quiet nod, and the staff moved with the ghostly efficiency of those who had mastered the art of being essential, yet entirely invisible. They were the silent cogs in a machine of unimaginable luxury. Their presence felt only in the seamless replenishment of a water glass or the timely arrival of a perfectly cooked dish. Elara Vance was a master of this invisibility. Her movements were a study in fluid economy, a ballet of professional deference honed over hundreds of nights serving the city's titans. Dressed in the restaurant's severe, tailored black uniform, she navigated the spaces between tables not as a person, but as a function. Her posture was perfect, her expression a carefully constructed mask of pleasant neutrality, her hands steady as she poured a 1982 Chateau Margaux without letting a single drop mar the pristine tablecloth. To the patrons of Aurelia, she was merely an extension of the service, as much a part of the decor as the polished mahogany walls or the fresh orchids at the center of each table. They looked through her, their eyes gliding past her face to settle on their dining companions, their minds occupied with stock prices and corporate takeovers. They never saw the flicker of fierce intelligence in her dark eyes, nor could they guess at the universe of knowledge that churned silently behind her placid facade, a world of complex chemical structures and academic triumphs that felt like a lifetime away. Beneath the veneer of the perfect waitress, Elara's mind was a fortress of memory and grief. Every perfectly plated dish she served, every exorbitant bill she presented, was a means to an end, a small step in a grueling marathon against time and forgetting. The scent of a lemon garnish would sometimes transport her not to the Amalfi Coast, but to the sharp, antiseptic smell of the sterile corridors of the long-term care facility where her father lay. His world had been reduced to a single room, his brilliant mind trapped within a body silenced by a catastrophic stroke. She could still feel the rough, worn fabric of his favorite armchair, the one he sat in while he taught her the periodic table as a child. That chair now sat empty in a storage unit, a relic of a life that had been systematically dismantled. The man who had once filled rooms with his booming laughter and sharp intellect was now a prisoner of silence, his eyes the only conduit for the frustration and love that remained. Elara's paycheck from Aurelia, a sum that felt both obscene and insufficient, went directly to the crushing monthly cost of his care, a constant, draining reminder of the injustice that had shattered their world. Her true expertise was a secret weapon, a phantom limb from her amputated past. Before she was Elara the waitress, she was Elara Vance, a doctoral candidate in toxicology at the top of her class, a prodigy with an almost supernatural sensory memory for chemical compounds. Where others saw a glass of water, she saw the potential for pH imbalances and the faint metallic tang of old pipes. The aroma of wine wasn't just fruity or oaky to her. It was a complex profile of esters, phenols, and tannins that she could deconstruct in her mind. This unique talent, a combination of innate ability and years of obsessive study, had once been her future. Now it was a quiet, useless hum beneath the surface of her mundane reality. She would catch the faint scent of an aldehyde in a patron's perfume and instinctively identify its molecular family. She would notice the subtle way a sauce separated and understand the chemical reaction causing it. It was a constant, painful whisper of the life she was supposed to have. a life of research and discovery that had been stolen from her, replaced by this gilded cage where her only purpose was to serve. The delicate equilibrium of the dining room fractured the moment Julian Croft arrived. He did not simply enter Aurelia, he conquered it. A palpable shift rippled through the space as he strode in, flanked by two younger, leaner men who moved with the predatory grace of loyal wolves. Croft was a man forged from pressure and ambition, his tailored suit a piece of dark armor over a powerful frame, a watch on his wrist that cost more than Alara's entire university education. His face was a mask of cold, imperious confidence, his eyes sweeping across the room with a look of bored ownership, dismissing everyone and everything as part of his personal dominion. The maître d'œuvre, a man who regularly greeted senators and foreign dignitaries with unflappable poise, seemed to shrink in his presence, his professional smile tightening into a nervous grimace. A hush fell over the nearby tables as Croft was led to the best seat in the house, a secluded booth that offered a commanding view of the entire restaurant. He moved not with the easy grace of old money, but with the aggressive certainty of a man who had taken everything he owned by force. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. We're about to travel to the heart of this city's corridors of power, but first, we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your location below, and be sure to subscribe to join our community. You're about to witness an incredible story of resilience. As we get started, drop your city or country in the comments. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is the perfect time to do it so you're always here for stories like this. It was Alara's section. A cold knot tightened in her stomach, a familiar feeling of dread she felt whenever a titan of industry sat at one of her tables. These men were all cut from the same cloth, their arrogance a uniform as telling as her own. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she approached the table, her notepad held ready. Croft didn't even look at her. He was speaking to his guest, a nervous-looking investor, his voice a low, confident rumble of corporate jargon and thinly veiled threats. Without breaking his monologue, he gestured impatiently at the drinks menu. "The McAllen. The 25. He snapped, the words clipped and dismissive. It wasn't a request. It was a decree. He was a man accustomed to the world reconfiguring itself to his whims. Alara simply nodded, her face betraying nothing of the contempt she felt. "Of course, sir," she murmured, her voice the epitome of professional servitude. As she turned to leave, she felt his dismissive gaze on her back, the casual, dehumanizing glance one might give to a piece of furniture that was momentarily in the way. It was a look she knew all too well, the look of a predator who saw the world as nothing more than his personal hunting ground. Returning from the bar, she carried the single glass on a small silver tray. The amber liquid within was worth more than her monthly rent, a symbol of a world so far removed from her own, it might as well have been on another planet. She placed it on the table with practiced care, her movements precise and silent, but as she began to pull back, her highly attuned senses snagged on something wrong, a tiny, discordant note in the symphony of the expensive scotch. It wasn't something anyone else would ever notice. It was a subtle, almost invisible viscous residue clinging to the side of the glass, a faint oily sheen that fractured the light in a way that pure, high-proof alcohol never should. Her gaze sharpened, and leaning forward ever so slightly under the guise of adjusting the coaster, she caught it. It was the faintest trace of an odorless solvent, a smell so subtle it was barely there, a chemical ghost hiding beneath the powerful peaty aroma of the scotch. It was a compound she knew intimately from her studies, one often used as a delivery agent for fast-acting, customized toxins. In that split second, her two worlds collided. The waitress and the toxicologist became one. A surge of pure adrenaline shot through her, cold and sharp, but her training took over, overriding the panic. Her mind raced, calculating the impossibly high stakes. To her left, the man who had ordered the drink continued his monologue, oblivious. To her right, The rest of the restaurant hummed along, a world of blissful ignorance. There was no time for deliberation, no room for error. Her instincts, honed by years of academic rigor, screamed a single undeniable truth. That glass contained a death sentence. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silent, deadly threat in front of her. She had to act, not with alarm, but with the same invisibility that was both her curse and her shield. Her training in the lab and her training on the restaurant floor merged into a single, decisive course of action. She had to intervene without revealing why, using the rules of her current world to solve a problem from her old one, with a calmness that felt utterly alien to the storm raging inside her. She reached forward. Her hand was perfectly steady, a testament to her iron-willed control. Her voice, when she spoke, was a soft, apologetic murmur, the practiced tone of a subordinate correcting a minor error. "My apologies, sir," she said, her eyes fixed on the glass, avoiding his gaze. "I noticed a slight imperfection on the glass. Allow me to replace it for you." Before he could process her words or react, her fingers closed around the poison chalice, lifting it from the table with a smooth, swift motion. The action was so quick, so professional, that it was meant to be a seamless, forgettable moment of excellent service. But she had interrupted a king in his court. She had broken the cardinal rule of her profession. She had made herself visible. She had dared to exercise judgment in a world where she was paid to have none, and in doing so, she had unknowingly lit the fuse on a bomb of pure, unadulterated ego. Julian Croft's monologue cut off abruptly. His head snapped toward her, his eyes, which had previously looked through her, now fixed on her with a sudden, blazing intensity. For a moment, there was only stunned silence as he stared at her hand, holding the glass he was about to drink. Then his face began to transform, the mask of bored arrogance melting away to reveal a visage of incandescent rage. A dark flush crept up his neck, his lips pulling back into a sneer of utter disbelief and contempt. "What did you just do?" he hissed, his voice low and menacing, yet carrying across the silent space. He rose slightly from his seat, his powerful frame looming over her. "Do you have any idea how much this drink costs? People like you should not be allowed to touch it." His voice grew louder with each word, drawing the attention of the surrounding tables. "Who in the hell do you think you are, you clumsy, insolent girl, to interrupt me and snatch my drink away?" As the public humiliation washed over her, the heat of shame rising in her cheeks, a different image burned in Alara's mind. The pale, tired face of her father in his hospital bed. The same dismissive arrogance, the same soulless power that dripped from Croft's every word, was the very force that had crushed her family. A cold fury began to solidify in her veins, a silent, unyielding strength that held her upright as the billionaire's tirade reached its cruel crescendo. The world of Aurelia for a suspended moment held its breath. The echo of Julian Croft's final, venomous words seemed to crystallize in the opulent air, hanging like a chandelier of pure contempt. The manager, a man named Philip, whose entire career was built on the art of placating the powerful, was already moving, his face a mask of frantic apology. He was a blur of motion, his polished shoes squeaking almost imperceptibly on the marble floor as he rushed toward their table, his hands outstretched in a gesture of supplication. For Alara, the universe had compressed into the space of this single, gilded cage. The stares of the other patrons felt like physical blows, each one a pinprick of judgment. She remained standing, her hand still holding the glass that had started it all, her posture an unyielding column of professional dignity. Inside, however, a glacial calm was spreading through her, a strange and potent antidote to the hot shame that lapped at the edges of her consciousness. It was the focus of the laboratory, the detached precision of a scientist observing a volatile reaction. She was no longer just a waitress being humiliated. She was a variable in an uncontrolled experiment, and her mind was already documenting the data, noting the flush on Croft's face, the tremor in the investor's hand, the exact decibel of the ensuing silence. Just as Philip reached the table, his mouth opening to unleash the inevitable stream of apologies and dismissals, a new sound shattered the tableau. It was not a whisper or a murmur, but a sharp, authoritative voice that cut through the tension with the precision of a scalpel. "Stop! Nobody touch that first glass!" The command came from a nearby table, where a man in his late 50s with a shock of silver hair and eyes that radiated a calm intensity was pushing his chair back with a loud scrape. He was rising to his feet, his dinner companion forgotten, his entire focus lasered in on the small drama unfolding around Alara. His movement was not one of idle curiosity. It was filled with an urgent, undeniable purpose that made everyone, including the advancing manager, freeze in place. The man's suit was well-tailored, but not ostentatious, and he carried himself not with the swagger of a CEO, but with the quiet authority of someone who deals in matters of life and death. He took 2 quick strides forward, his gaze fixed not on the enraged billionaire but on the small, amber-filled vessel in Alara's steady hand, as if it were the most important object in the entire world. The man, who Ilara would later learn was a renowned cardiologist named Dr. Eris Thorne, did not wait for permission to speak. His voice filled the sudden vacuum, each word clear, concise, and heavy with implication. "The man who was just at my table," he began, gesturing with his chin toward the now empty chair beside him, "was just taken into custody by 2 detectives in the restroom. He was Croft's former business partner." A collective, low gasp rippled through the assembled diners. The narrative of a clumsy waitress and an irritated tycoon was dissolving in real time, replaced by something far more sinister. Dr. Thorne continued, his eyes now sweeping from the glass to Croft's stunned face. Before they took him away, he confessed, he admitted to poisoning that scotch. The word poisoning landed in the silent room with the force of a physical impact. It was an ugly, brutal word that had no place amidst the polished silver and fine crystal of Aurelia. It spoke of betrayal, of violence, of a darkness that the restaurant's golden light was supposed to keep at bay. The doctor's words recontextualized everything, transforming Ilara's strange action from an act of incompetence into an act of inexplicable, life-saving prescience. Every eye in the room, which had moments before been fixed on Ilara with pity or scorn, now swiveled in unison. First, they looked at the glass she still held. It no longer looked like an overpriced drink. It looked like a weapon. The amber liquid, which had seemed so rich and inviting, now held a malevolent gleam. The subtle, oily sheen she had noticed, invisible to everyone else, now seemed to scream its deadly secret to the world. The light from the chandeliers caught its surface, not with a warm glow, but with a cold, chemical shimmer. It was a vessel of quiet, waiting death, a testament to the brutal realities that lurked just beneath the civilized veneer of this world. The entire, elaborate performance of wealth and power had been brought to a halt by a few milliliters of liquid, a silent testament to the fragility of the men who believed themselves to be invincible. The air grew thick with the unspoken horror of what had almost happened. The closeness of the call, the sheer audacity of an assassination attempt in the city's most secure and exclusive dining establishment. Then, inevitably, all eyes turned to Julian Croft. The transformation was profound and immediate. The dark, furious flush drained from his face, leaving behind a pallid, almost grayish complexion. His mouth, which had been twisted into a sneer of contempt, fell slightly slack, his lips parted in disbelief. The imperious rage in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by a wide, vacant stare of pure shock, followed by a flicker of something he so rarely allowed himself to feel: raw, primal fear. He looked from the doctor to the glass, and then, finally, his gaze landed on Ilara. It was a look stripped of all its former arrogance. He was no longer seeing a piece of furniture, an incompetent servant, or an insignificant girl. He was seeing the woman who, for reasons he could not possibly comprehend, had stood between him and a violent, agonizing death. The foundations of his world, built on the certainty of his own power and the insignificance of others, had been shaken to their very core. He was vulnerable, he was mortal. And the person who had just proven it to him was the very same person he had been trying to utterly destroy just moments before. Ilara felt the weight of his stare, and for the first time, she did not look away. She met his gaze directly, her own expression unreadable. The symphony of chaos in her mind had quieted, replaced by a single, resonant chord of vindication. But there was no triumph in it. Only a cold, hard clarity. She had not acted to save him, the man. She had acted to solve a puzzle, to neutralize a threat, an instinct born from her training. She had reacted to a chemical compound, not a human being. The fact that the vessel for that compound was Julian Croft was a coincidence of cosmic and perhaps cruel proportions. In that moment, as the entire restaurant stared at them, a silent, invisible transfer of power occurred. He was the billionaire, the titan, the king, but she was the one who held his life, or what was left of it, in her hand. She was the one who had seen the truth that his power and wealth had blinded him to. And in his shocked, fearful eyes, she saw not a monster, but something far more pathetic. A man utterly terrified by the sudden realization that he was not, in fact, a god. But the psyche of a man like Julian Croft is a fortress built to withstand any assault, even one from reality itself. The shock, the fear, the humbling realization of his own mortality, these were foreign invaders, and his ego, a tyrant in its own right, moved swiftly to repel them. The pallor on his face was quickly replaced by a dark mottled red. The fear in his eyes was incinerated by a fresh surge of incandescent fury. To be a victim was to be weak, and weakness was the only sin in his unforgiving creed. He could not accept gratitude, for that would be an admission of dependence. He could not accept being saved, for that would validate the agency of someone he considered beneath him. And so, his mind performed a grotesque and immediate contortion, twisting the narrative into one he could control. He needed a new target, a new focus for the rage that was boiling inside him, a way to reclaim his dominance in a room that had just witnessed his ultimate vulnerability. His eyes, now hard and cold as chips of granite, narrowed as they focused back on Ilara. He turned to the still-frozen manager, Philip, his voice a low, menacing snarl that was somehow more terrifying than his previous shouting. "This changes nothing," he hissed, the words dripping with a chilling paranoia. "How do we know she wasn't part of it? A diversion? A way to make the accomplice look like a hero?" The accusation was absurd, a desperate lunge from a cornered animal, but in the world Croft inhabited, plausibility was irrelevant. Power was what mattered. His words were not meant to be believed. They were meant to reassert control, to sow chaos, to shift the spotlight of scrutiny away from his own weakness and onto someone else. He took a step toward Ilara, his presence once again looming and oppressive. He didn't look at her, instead addressing the manager and the security guards, who were now cautiously approaching the table. "I don't care if she's a hero or a conspirator. Her presence here is a liability, it's a security risk. I want her gone." The logic was twisted, but the command was absolute, backed by the unspoken threat of his immense influence. Philip the manager, a man caught in an impossible crossfire, made his choice in an instant. On one side was the undeniable fact that his waitress had just saved the life of his most important client. On the other was the client himself, a man who could destroy his restaurant and his career with a single phone call, demanding that same waitress be removed. He chose power. He always chose power. He turned to Ilara, his face a miserable portrait of regret and capitulation. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry. You have to understand my position. Please, gather your things. Security will escort you out." There was no argument, no defense offered on her behalf. The verdict had been delivered by the man who paid the bills. and the system, as it always did, clicked into place to execute his will. The doctor, Eris Thorne, started to protest, his face a mask of disbelief at the gross injustice unfolding. But one of Croft's security men moved to block his path, a silent, immovable wall of muscle and loyalty. Justice had no currency here, only power mattered. The finality of it was brutal. 2 security guards, large men in ill-fitting suits, moved to flank her. They did not touch her, but their proximity was a form of physical coercion, a clear signal that her time in this gilded world was over. Croft turned his back on her completely, a final, deliberate act of dismissal. He was already rebuilding his fortress, erasing her from the narrative, recasting himself as the man in control. Illyra looked down at the glass still in her hand. She carefully placed it on the tray held by a trembling busboy, her movements as precise and steady as ever. She did not cry. She did not protest. The cold fury that had been building within her had now solidified into something harder, something more permanent. It was no longer an emotion. It was a structural component of her being. As she was led away from the table, past the gawking faces of the patrons and the averted eyes of her former colleagues, a single burning image filled her mind. Her father, sitting in his wheelchair, staring out the window of the care facility, his own life and career destroyed by the very same brand of casual, unaccountable cruelty. The walk out of Aurelia was the longest of her life. Every step echoed with the finality of her dismissal. The opulent decor, the warm golden light, the scent of truffle and old money, it all seemed to mock her as she was escorted toward the service exit. She was being ejected from a world she had only ever served, a world that had just chewed her up and spat her out after she had performed an act of profound, life-altering service. The heavy kitchen doors swung shut behind her, the sudden clang of steel a stark punctuation mark on her career. She was thrust from the hushed, carpeted silence of the dining room into the chaotic, clattering reality of the back alley. The air here was cold and damp, thick with the smell of grease and garbage. It was a world away from the perfumed atmosphere inside, a fitting metaphor for the sudden, brutal descent she had just experienced. She stood there for a long moment in her severe black uniform, the sounds of the city's nightlife a distant roar, feeling the full weight of her new reality crash down upon her. Fired, blacklisted, and utterly alone. The journey home on the late-night bus was a surreal haze. The fluorescent lights of the bus cast a sickly, greenish pallor on the faces of the other tired passengers, a stark contrast to the honeyed glow of Aurelia's chandeliers. The city slid past the grimy window, a blur of neon and concrete. With every block, the crushing reality of her situation grew heavier. The rent was due in a week. Her father's medical bills were a relentless, ever-present mountain of debt. The job at Aurelia, with its lucrative tips from the city's elite, had been her lifeline, the one thing that kept their heads above water. Now, that lifeline was severed. A wave of pure, unadulterated panic washed over her, so intense it made her feel nauseous. How would she pay for his care? How would she afford the specialized treatments he needed? The image of her father, helpless and dependent, fueled her terror. Croft hadn't just taken her job, he had taken her ability to care for the only person who mattered in her world. He had, for the second time, aimed a weapon at the heart of her family. She finally reached her small, third-floor walk-up apartment, the air inside still and cold. The space was sparse, furnished with second-hand items and piles of textbooks she could never bring herself to sell. They were relics of her other life, monuments to a future that had been stolen. She sank onto the worn sofa, the springs groaning in protest, and for the first time that night, the iron control she had maintained finally began to crack. A single, hot tear traced a path down her cheek, followed by another. It wasn't a cry of self-pity, but a release of the immense pressure that had been building inside her for years. It was a tear for her stolen future, for her silenced father, for the crushing, relentless injustice of a world where men like Julian Croft could destroy lives with no consequences. The humiliation, the fear, the rage, the despair, it all swirled within her, a suffocating vortex of emotion that threatened to pull her under completely. She felt a profound and terrifying sense of hopelessness settle over her, the feeling of being a single, powerless individual against an unstoppable machine of wealth and influence. But as she sat there in the darkness, her gaze fell upon a framed photograph on the cluttered side table. It was a picture of her and her father, taken years ago on the day she had won a prestigious university scholarship. They were both beaming, his arm draped proudly around her shoulders. He was a tall, vibrant man in the photograph, his eyes sparkling with intelligence and love. He was the man who had taught her to see the world not as it was, but as a series of fascinating chemical reactions. He had taught her that truth was the most stable element of all, and that integrity was the only catalyst for real change. Looking at his face, at the man he was before Croft Global Industries had broken him, something inside Alara began to shift. The despair did not vanish, but it was joined by something else, something older and far more powerful. It was the echo of her father's unwavering belief in justice. It was the memory of his courage in the face of a corporate Goliath. The fire of her rage, which had been a destructive, chaotic force, began to temper and focus, solidifying from a wildfire into the clean, white-hot flame of a cutting torch. A new thought began to form in her mind, sharp and clear, cutting through the fog of her despair. This was not a random act of misfortune. This was not a coincidence. The universe had not just dealt her a cruel hand. It had placed her face to face with the architect of her family's ruin. She had been given an opportunity, a terrible and profound one. She had seen the man who had destroyed her father in a moment of his greatest weakness. She had seen his fear. She understood, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that she was uniquely positioned to do what her father no longer could. She could fight back. The decision solidified in her mind, not as a choice, but as an inevitability. She would no longer be a passive victim of his world. She would no longer stand by while he lived in his gilded cage, oblivious to the wreckage he left in his wake. She would not seek revenge in the way his partner had, with poison and violence. She would seek something far more devastating. She would seek justice, and she would use the one weapon he could never anticipate, her mind. The first rays of dawn were beginning to slice through the blinds, casting long, dusty stripes across the floor. Alara had not slept. She had spent the night at her small desk, the glow of her laptop screen illuminating her face. The news was everywhere. Online articles and morning news segments were buzzing with the story of the failed assassination attempt on the life of billionaire Julian Croft. His face was plastered on every screen, his expression carefully curated to look stoic and unshaken. The articles mentioned the quick thinking of an unnamed waitress, a footnote in the larger, more glamorous story of corporate intrigue and attempted murder. As she read his name over and over, Julian Croft, CEO of Croft Global Industries, the connection that had been a gut feeling the night before became a concrete, undeniable fact. It was him. The articles detailed his company's history of aggressive acquisitions and ruthless efficiency, and a quick search brought up the takeover of Northgate Chemical, the company where her father had worked. The dates lined up perfectly. It was all there, a digital trail leading directly from his corporate conquest to her family's decimation. A cold, calculated resolve settled over her. The emotional turmoil of the previous night had been burned away, leaving behind a singular, unyielding purpose. She knew she couldn't do this alone. She was a blacklisted waitress, with no resources and no power. Croft was a titan, surrounded by lawyers and fixers, insulated by layers of wealth and influence. To fight him, she needed help. She needed someone who understood the system, someone who knew how to navigate the treacherous landscape of investigative work. Her mind immediately went to one person, Dr. Alistair Finch, her former doctoral advisor at the university. Finch was more than a professor. He had been her mentor, a brilliant and fiercely ethical man who had been devastated when she had been forced to drop out of the program. He had since retired from academia and now worked with a small, non-profit organization dedicated to investigative journalism, using his scientific expertise to expose corporate and environmental crimes. He was the only person she knew who possessed both the knowledge and the integrity to help her. With a hand that was surprisingly steady, she picked up her phone and found his number. It had been years since they had spoken, and a knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. What would she say? How could she possibly explain the bizarre, convoluted story that had led her to this point? She took a deep breath and pressed the call button, the electronic tone drilling into the quiet of her apartment. He answered on the third ring, his voice slightly gravelly with sleep, but instantly recognizable. Alistair Finch. She hesitated for only a second. Professor Finch, she began, her voice clearer and stronger than she expected. It's Alara. Alara Vance. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then a warmth flooded his voice. Alara, my goodness, it's been too long. How are you? The simple, kind question almost broke her resolve, but she held firm. I'm okay, Professor, but I need your help. I have a story. It's about Julian Croft. She said his name, and the line went silent for a moment, a silence pregnant with meaning. Finch knew the name. Everyone knew the name. She spent the next hour on the phone, her voice low and even, laying out the entire story. She started with the night before at Aurelia, the poisoned scotch, the public humiliation, and the firing. She then connected it to the past, to her father, to Northgate Chemical, and to the smear campaign that had ruined him. She recounted the details with the dispassionate precision of a scientist presenting a paper, sticking to the facts, letting the sheer weight of the injustice speak for itself. Alistair Finch listened without interruption, his silence a testament to the gravity of her story. When she finally finished, there was a long pause. She could hear the faint sound of him breathing, the scratching of a pen on paper. Alara, he finally said, and his voice had lost all of its earlier warmth, replaced by a cold, hard anger. What you're describing, it's monstrous. But are you sure you want to do this? Taking on a man like Croft is not just difficult, it's dangerous. He will come after you with everything he has. His words were a warning, a final chance to turn back. He already has, Alara replied, her voice unwavering. He did it years ago. He did it again last night. I'm not afraid of him anymore, Professor. I just want the truth to come out. For my father. Her words hung in the air, a simple, powerful declaration of intent. She could almost hear the decision being made on the other end of the line. Finch was a man who had dedicated his life to the pursuit of truth, and he had just been presented with a case that was a grotesque perversion of everything he believed in. All right, Alara, he said, his voice firm with renewed purpose. Meet me at my office this afternoon. The old address. Bring everything you have, every memory, every detail. We're going to need to be very, very careful. We're going to need a plan. The call ended, and Alara felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in a very long time. A flicker of hope. It was a small, fragile flame in the vast darkness of her situation, but it was there. She was no longer just a victim. She was an agent. The game had begun. That afternoon, she found herself standing outside the unassuming brick building that housed the Center for Public Integrity, the non-profit where Finch now worked. The office was the antithesis of Aurelia, cluttered, chaotic, and buzzing with a palpable energy of righteous purpose. Books and files were stacked in precarious towers, and the air smelled of old paper, stale coffee, and determination. Alistair Finch greeted her at the door, his face etched with concern, but his eyes sharp and focused. He led her to a small, windowless conference room, the walls of which were covered in whiteboards filled with complex diagrams and timelines from other investigations. For the next 3 hours they talked. Alara recounted every detail, while Finch listened, interjecting only to ask pointed, clarifying questions. He was no longer her gentle professor. He was a master strategist, mapping out the battlefield, identifying the enemy's strengths and weaknesses. He probed the gaps in her memory, forcing her to recall conversations her father had at the dinner table, names of colleagues he had mentioned, fragments of information that had seemed insignificant at the time. As she spoke, a strategy began to take shape on the whiteboard behind her. Finch drew a complex web, with Julian Croft at the center. Radiating out from him were his companies, his known associates, and his political connections. Then, in a different color, he began to map out a counter-strategy. Croft's greatest strength is his power, Finch explained, tapping the board with his pen. He can buy silence, he can manipulate the media, he can bury us in legal fees. We cannot fight him on that battlefield. His greatest weakness, however, is the same as any narcissist: his ego. He believes he is untouchable. That makes him sloppy. He leaves tracks, because he doesn't believe anyone is capable of following them. Finch's words resonated with what Illyra had witnessed firsthand. Croft's arrogance was not just a personality flaw, it was a strategic vulnerability. He had underestimated her at the restaurant, and he had almost paid for it with his life. He had underestimated her father years ago, believing he could be easily silenced and forgotten. That same arrogance would be his downfall. The initial phase of their plan was deceptively simple. They needed to find the one thing Croft couldn't buy or bury. They needed irrefutable proof. "Your father was a whistleblower," Finch stated, his eyes locking onto hers. "He must have had documentation, reports, internal memos, chemical analysis data. Something that proves Northgate was knowingly dumping toxic waste, and that the orders came from the top, from Croft's people after the takeover. Croft's team would have scrubbed the company's records clean, but your father, a man like your father, would have kept a private copy. A failsafe. We need to find it." The thought struck Illyra like a lightning bolt. Her father had been meticulous, a man who documented everything. In the chaotic aftermath of his stroke and their financial ruin, all of his personal effects had been hastily packed away into a storage unit on the industrial outskirts of the city, a place she hadn't visited in years. It was a long shot, a desperate hope, but it was the only lead they had. The storage facility was a bleak, sprawling complex of corrugated metal and faded paint. The air inside was stale and thick, with the scent of dust and forgotten memories. Using a key that felt foreign in her hand, Illyra rolled up the heavy metal door to Unit 237. The contents of her family's former life were revealed. A chaotic jumble of furniture shrouded in white sheets, sealed boxes, and stacked plastic tubs. It was a tomb of a life that had been violently interrupted. A wave of grief washed over her as she looked at the silent, shrouded forms. She could almost see her father in his favorite armchair, reading a book, or her mother arranging flowers on the dining table. For a moment, the weight of her task felt insurmountable. How could she possibly find a single file in this mountain of disorganized history? But the image of Finch's whiteboard, of their nascent plan, solidified her resolve. She took a deep breath, pulled the string for the single bare bulb overhead, and began to dig. For hours she worked in the dim, dusty light, her hands growing grimy as she sorted through box after box. She moved through layers of her own past, old school projects, childhood photo albums, her mother's collection of porcelain birds. Each item was a ghost, a memory that threatened to pull her off course. She had to force herself to stay focused, to look for the specific, professional-looking file boxes from her father's home office. The sun began to set, and the unheated unit grew cold, but she pressed on, driven by a desperate burning hope. Finally, in the farthest corner, tucked behind a stack of old winter coats, she found it. It was a heavy-duty, waterproof document case, the kind used for protecting sensitive materials. It was locked with a combination lock. She stared at it, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what the combination could be. She tried birthdays, anniversaries, old addresses, all with no success. Despair began to creep back in. Then, she remembered something, a silly little inside joke between her and her father. When she was learning the periodic table, he had nicknamed her Ela, after the element lanthanum, atomic number 57, because he said she was rare and foundational to his world. Her own atomic number, with trembling fingers she With trembling fingers, she dialed the numbers into the small, cold brass wheels of the combination lock. 5, 7. The atomic number for lanthanum. The number her father had assigned to her in their secret language of science and affection. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. The lock remained stubbornly sealed, a final gatekeeper to the past. Despair, cold and familiar, began to prick at the edges of her resolve. But then she applied a little more pressure, turning the final wheel a fraction of a millimeter further, and a quiet, definitive click echoed in the dusty silence of the storage unit. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock that had not been opened in years, the sound of a forgotten world breathing its first breath. She lifted the heavy lid, and the air that escaped was thick with the scent of old paper, aged leather, and the faintest, almost imperceptible trace of her father's pipe tobacco, a ghost of an aroma that struck her with the force of a physical blow. Inside there were no loose papers, no chaotic jumble. It was a meticulously organized archive of a man who knew he was going to war and was preparing his arsenal. There were files, each one neatly labeled in his precise architectural handwriting. There were cassette tapes, floppy disks, and even a series of dated journals, their pages filled with his elegant script. This was not just a box of evidence. It was a time capsule of a man's integrity, a final, defiant testament against the forces that had sought to erase him from the world. Back in the chaotic sanctuary of Alistair Finch's office, the contents of the document case were spread across the large conference table, like the sacred texts of a lost civilization. The bare fluorescent lights of the room seemed harsh and inadequate compared to the profound truths laid bare before them. For hours they worked in a state of reverent, focused silence, broken only by the soft rustle of paper and Finch's occasional, low whistle of disbelief. The chemical analysis reports were even more damning than Alara had imagined. They showed with cold, scientific certainty the presence of carcinogenic compounds in local water tables at levels hundreds of times the legal limit, all directly traceable to the Northgate chemical plant's outflow pipes. The internal memos, which her father had painstakingly copied, showed a clear chain of command, with signatures being forged on safety compliance forms. But it was the journals that held the true devastating power of the collection. Her father had chronicled everything. He documented his initial discovery, his attempts to raise the alarm through proper channels, and the subsequent chilling meetings with the new management installed by Croft Global. He wrote about the veiled threats, the sudden internal audits targeting his department, and the slow, creeping realization that he was not dealing with corporate negligence, but with a deliberate, calculated criminal conspiracy orchestrated from the very top. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the piles of incriminating paper, Finch finally leaned back in his chair, his face a grim mask of weary triumph. He ran a hand through his silver hair, his eyes reflecting a mixture of awe at her father's meticulous work and cold fury at the man it incriminated. The evidence was a mountain, a comprehensive and irrefutable indictment of Croft Global's crimes against the environment and against her father. Yet as Finch began to outline their legal strategy, a formidable obstacle emerged from the labyrinth of corporate law. He explained that while the documents were powerful, Croft's legal team, a veritable army of the most expensive and ruthless lawyers money could buy, would immediately move to discredit them. They would claim the copies were forgeries, that the data was fabricated by a disgruntled employee seeking revenge for his termination. They would bury them in motions and procedural delays, bleeding their small non-profit dry long before the case ever saw the inside of a courtroom. They had a powerful story, but they were missing the one thing that could shatter Croft's wall of plausible deniability. They needed a human element. They needed an insider, a witness who could corroborate her father's journals and testify under oath to the orders that were given. The journals themselves provided the name. Her father mentioned him frequently, first with professional respect, then with growing suspicion, and finally with a kind of weary pity. Marcus Thorne. He was Julian Croft's man on the inside during the Northgate takeover, a young, ambitious executive vice president who had been tasked with implementing the aggressive cost-cutting measures. He was the one who had delivered the warnings to her father, the one whose signature appeared on the falsified safety reports, the one who had been the public face of the new management. He was, as Finch called him, the linchpin, the one man who could directly connect the criminal actions at the plant to the commands issued from Croft's executive suite. The search for him began with a feverish intensity, a digital manhunt through the sprawling archives of the internet. But it quickly became apparent that Marcus Thorne had, for all intents and purposes, ceased to exist. His professional networking profiles had been deleted. There were no recent public records, no property deeds, no social media presence. It was as if a ghost had meticulously wiped his footprints from the sands of the digital world, leaving behind a void that spoke volumes about the power and paranoia of the man he had once served. Days turned into a week, and the initial optimism began to curdle into a grim, grinding frustration. Every lead they pursued ended in a digital dead end, a 404 error, a disconnected phone number. It felt as if they were chasing a phantom, a man deliberately erased from the modern world. Ilara felt the immense, suffocating weight of Julian Croft's influence, an invisible force field that could not only ruin lives but could seemingly unmake them, editing people out of public existence as easily as deleting a line of code. The frustration was a physical thing, a knot in her stomach that tightened with each failed search. She was so close, closer than anyone had ever been to exposing Croft, yet she was being thwarted by a ghost. The trail was cold, and the hope that had burned so brightly just days before was beginning to flicker, threatened by the vast, dark resources of their enemy. She found herself staring at the whiteboard in Finch's office, at the name Marcus Thorne circled in red, a symbol of their one great hope and their most profound failure. It was in that moment of near despair that her scientific training kicked in, a lifetime of methodical thinking pushing back against the emotional tide. She had been searching for the man himself, a direct approach. It was time to think like a toxicologist, to look for the trace elements he might have left behind, the indirect markers of his existence. Her mind shifted from brute force searching to elegant lateral thinking. If Thorne himself was invisible, perhaps the people in his orbit were not. She abandoned the financial and legal databases and turned her focus to the softer, more human archives of the past. She began digging through the online archives of Northgate Chemical's old corporate newsletters, mundane, forgotten publications filled with pictures of company picnics and employee anniversaries. For hours, she scrolled through grainy, low-resolution PDFs, the digital equivalent of digging through a dusty attic. And then she found it. It was a small, insignificant article from over a decade ago, celebrating a local charity art auction sponsored by the company. The article featured a picture of a beaming Marcus Thorne standing beside his wife, Amelia, who was holding a small, rather amateurish landscape painting. The caption identified her as an aspiring artist and a passionate supporter of the local arts community. It was a tiny, fragile thread, a nearly invisible clue left behind in the fossil record of corporate life, but for Ilara, it was a lifeline. It was a new vector of attack, a way to triangulate the position of their ghost by tracking the light of a star that had once revolved around him. Alistair Finch, with his decades of experience as a journalist, knew how to approach such a delicate situation. A direct inquiry about Marcus would almost certainly spook his wife, especially if she was living in fear. He began by subtly probing the regional art communities in the states surrounding their own, searching for any mention of an artist named Amelia Thorne. After 2 days of careful searching, he found a match. An artist named Amelia Vance. She had taken Ilara's surname, a common tactic for people trying to disappear, was listed as a participant in a small gallery show in a quiet, rural town 3 states away. Her online artist bio was vague, mentioning only her love for pastoral landscapes and her move to the area a few years prior to seek a more peaceful life. Finch made the initial call, presenting himself as a freelance journalist working on a feature story about artists who had abandoned the city for the countryside. Amelia's voice on the phone was hesitant, guarded. She politely declined the interview, claiming she was a very private person. Her refusal was polite. but the undercurrent of fear was unmistakable. It was the sound of a person who had spent years looking over her shoulder, a person for whom any unexpected contact was a potential threat. Ilara knew then that she had to be the one to go. Finch was a brilliant strategist, but this was no longer a matter of strategy. This was a matter of human connection, of shared trauma. A man in a suit asking questions would only reinforce the walls Amelia had built around her life. But another woman, another victim of the same man, might be able to find the door. 2 days later, Ilara found herself driving down the main street of a small, picturesque town that felt like a world away from the steel and glass canyons of her city. The air was clean, the streets were lined with quaint, historic buildings, and the pace of life seemed gentle and unhurried. It was a place designed for healing, for forgetting. She found Amelia in her small studio gallery, a bright, airy space filled with canvases of rolling hills and serene sunsets. Amelia was a woman whose gentle face was etched with a quiet, permanent sadness. Ilara didn't introduce herself as an investigator or a journalist. She walked in as a customer, admired the paintings, and then, when the moment was right, she simply introduced herself by her real name. "My name is Ilara Vance," she said softly. "My father was Henry Vance. He worked with your husband at Northgate." The flicker of recognition, quickly followed by a wave of pure, undiluted fear in Amelia's eyes, told Ilara she had come to the right place. The conversation that followed was not an interrogation. It was a confession, a shared unburdening of grief. They sat in the back room of the gallery, surrounded by the scent of turpentine and oil paint, and Ilara laid her story bare. She spoke of her father not as a whistleblower or a victim, but as a brilliant, loving man who had been systematically broken. She described the stroke, the loss of his voice, the daily struggle for dignity in the sterile environment of the care facility. She did not speak of vengeance or justice, but of the profound, aching void his destruction had left in her life. As she spoke, she saw the walls of fear in Amelia's eyes begin to crumble, replaced by the glistening sheen of unshed tears. She was not seeing an enemy or a threat. She was seeing a mirror image of her own pain, a reflection of the quiet devastation that Julian Croft left in his wake. The story of Henry Vance's ruin was, in so many ways, the story of Marcus Thorne's as well. They were two different men, on opposite sides of the same moral battlefield, who had both been consumed by the same insatiable fire. With a shuddering breath, Amelia finally broke the silence that had shrouded her life for a decade. Her voice was a low, trembling whisper as she recounted the story of her husband's downfall. Marcus, she explained, had not been a monster. He had been ambitious, yes, and perhaps naive, but he had a conscience. After carrying out Croft's orders to silence Henry Vance, he had been consumed by a guilt that ate away at him day and night. He began drinking heavily, plagued by nightmares. He tried to anonymously leak documents to the press, to undo some of the damage he had done, but Croft's internal security was absolute. He was caught. But Julian Croft was too clever to create a martyr by firing him. Instead, he used a draconian non-disclosure agreement, a legal document laced with such terrifying financial penalties for any breach that it was essentially a contract of indentured servitude, to purchase Marcus's silence for life. He then systematically dismantled his career, blacklisting him throughout the industry until he was unemployable. The pressure, the guilt, and the powerlessness had shattered him, triggering a complete nervous breakdown from which he had never fully recovered. He was a ghost, a man hollowed out by fear, living in a small, dark apartment just a few blocks from the gallery, afraid of his own shadow. The meeting with Marcus Thorne was like visiting a man in his own tomb. The apartment was dark, the curtains drawn tight against the afternoon sun, the air stale and heavy with defeat. Marcus himself was a specter, a thin, pale man with haunted eyes that darted nervously around the room as if expecting one of Croft's enforcers to burst through the door at any moment. He was a man living in a prison of his own fear, and the bars were forged from the memory of Julian Croft's limitless cruelty. He listened to Ilara's plea with a kind of agitated resignation, shaking his head before she even finished speaking. He couldn't help her. He wouldn't. The NDA was absolute. Croft would not just sue him, he would annihilate him. He would take the small disability pension he lived on, he would take their home, he would take what little peace his wife had managed to find in this quiet town. He was a broken man, and his only remaining instinct was to curl up and protect the fragile remnants of his life from any further harm. He was a dead end, a final, insurmountable wall of fear that stood between Alara and the justice she so desperately sought. Alara watched the terror flicker in Marcus Thorne's eyes, and she understood that no amount of logical persuasion or emotional pleading would break through it. He was too far gone, too deeply scarred by the psychological warfare Croft had waged against him, so she did not argue, she did not press. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out one of her father's leather-bound journals. She opened it to a page she had marked, the paper soft and worn beneath her fingers. Her voice was quiet, not accusatory, as she read the entry aloud. It was from the week before her father was fired, a passage where he described his final, tense meeting with Marcus. But instead of anger, her father had written with a surprising, profound empathy. He wrote that he could see the conflict in the young executive's eyes, the deep unease behind the corporate mask. He described Marcus not as a villain, but as a man trapped in a golden cage. Another soul being slowly crushed by the immense amoral weight of Croft's ambition. As Alara's voice filled the dim, silent room with her father's compassionate words, something in Marcus Thorne finally, irrevocably, broke. A single tear traced a path through the pale stubble on his cheek. To be shown such grace, such understanding, from the very man he had helped to destroy, was a more powerful catalyst than any threat or promise could ever be. It was an absolution he had never believed possible, and it gave him the one thing he had lost a decade ago, a flicker of his own courage. With a hand that trembled not from fear but from a decade of repressed conviction, Marcus walked over to a small, dusty safe in the corner of the room. He worked the combination and pulled out a small, antiquated digital audio recorder. He explained that in his final weeks at Northgate, he had become consumed by the paranoid certainty that Croft was setting him up to be the sole scapegoat for the entire operation. So in a desperate act of self-preservation, he had carried this recorder into his last one-on-one meeting with Julian Croft. He had captured it all. He had the recording of Croft, his voice calm and chillingly devoid of emotion, giving the direct, unambiguous order to falsify the environmental data, to bury the reports, and to, quote, handle the Henry Vance problem by any means necessary, explicitly authorizing the frame-up and the smear campaign. It was the smoking gun. It was the linchpin. It was the irrefutable, undeniable proof that connected the crime directly to the criminal, a voice from the past that would become the instrument of his final judgment. He handed the small device to Alara, an act that felt like the passing of a sacred torch, a transfer of responsibility from one of Croft's victims to the other. The air in Alistair Finch's office was electric, with a tension that was equal parts triumph and horror. They sat in the dark, the only light coming from the glowing audio levels on Finch's computer monitor, and listened. The audio quality was not perfect. There was a faint hiss, the distant clink of a coffee cup, but Julian Croft's voice was utterly, terrifyingly clear. It was the voice of a man who did not believe in consequences, a man discussing the destruction of another human being with the same detached, clinical tone he might use to approve a quarterly budget. Every word was a nail in his own coffin. He mocked Henry Vance's integrity, calling it a, quote, liability. He laid out the plan to plant falsified documents on his computer. He authorized the use of private investigators to dig for any personal failing they could exploit in the media. Listening to it, Alara felt a cold sickness spread through her. It was one thing to know what he had done. It was another to hear the casual, remorseless evil in his own voice, to hear the methodical, unfeeling precision with which he had orchestrated her family's ruin. When the recording ended, a profound silence filled the room. Finch slowly removed his headphones, his face pale. "We have him," he whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of disgust and awe. "We have the monster, cold and clear, with the irrefutable evidence finally in their possession." The conversation shifted from investigation to execution. Their initial thought was to leak the recording to a major news outlet, to let the world hear Croft's monstrous confession. But Finch, with his veteran journalist's cynicism, quickly dismissed the idea. A man like Croft, he argued, did not fight his battles in the court of public opinion. He owned the court. His public relations team was the best in the world, a machine built for crisis management. They would immediately claim the recording was a deepfake, a sophisticated fabrication created by corporate rivals or disgruntled former employees. They would hire audio experts to sow doubt, and they would unleash their army of lawyers to bury any news organization that published it under an avalanche of defamation lawsuits. A simple media leak would become a protracted war of attrition, a battle of experts and sound bites that would allow Croft to muddy the waters and control the narrative. No, to truly destroy him, they needed to detonate this bomb in a place where his PR machine and his lawyers would be utterly powerless to contain the blast. They needed a stage where the accusation and the proof could be delivered simultaneously, in front of an audience he could not intimidate and in a context he could not spin. It was Alara who found the perfect stage. While researching Croft's public activities, she discovered the event that was the absolute cornerstone of his carefully constructed public image, the annual Croft Foundation Heart of the City Gala. It was the most exclusive and highly publicized philanthropic event of the year, a night where Croft presented himself not as a ruthless corporate raider, but as a benevolent civic leader, a patron saint of the city's hospitals and museums. He was scheduled to receive the, quote, Philanthropist of the Year award, a title he had essentially bought for himself through millions in tax-deductible donations. The irony was so profound, so grotesque, that it was perfect. It was a temple built to his own ego, a night dedicated to celebrating his public virtue. There could be no more fitting place to expose his private evil, to unmask him in front of the very people whose approval he craved, to turn his greatest moment of public relations triumph into his ultimate, inescapable humiliation, would be a form of justice far more poetic and devastating than any courtroom verdict. The plan was audacious, dangerous, and a perfect reflection of the man they sought to destroy. The immediate and most significant challenge was access. The Heart of the City Gala was a fortress. The guest list was a curated collection of the city's most powerful figures, and security was managed by a private firm with military-grade protocols. Finch immediately began working his extensive network of contacts in the media, trying to secure a press pass for Alara under the guise of a freelance journalist doing a profile on modern philanthropy. He called in favors that were decades old, leveraging every ounce of his professional credibility. But the wall was impenetrable. Croft's team controlled the media list with an iron fist, allowing access only to friendly, pre-vetted journalists who could be counted on to write glowing puff pieces. Every request Finch made was politely but firmly denied. They were locked out. The perfect stage was set, the weapon was ready, but the doors to the theater were barred. The familiar feeling of being outmatched by Croft's immense resources began to creep back in, a cold shadow threatening to eclipse their carefully laid plans. It seemed that once again the power of his wealth had created an obstacle that their simple pursuit of truth could not overcome. As Finch sat defeated at his desk, staring at the final rejection email, Alara's mind was already racing, probing for another way in. If the front door was locked, she would find the back door. She had spent years of her life navigating the hidden corridors of the city's elite establishments, the service entrances and back hallways that were invisible to the guests, but essential to the functioning of their world. She remembered the name of the high-end catering company that handled all the major galas, a company whose staff she had worked alongside during her time at Aurelia. She knew their hiring practices, their reliance on temporary staff for large events, and the often chaotic nature of their onboarding process. An idea, bold and beautifully symmetrical, began to form in her mind. Julian Croft had cast her out, had humiliated her for being a service worker, had deemed her invisible and insignificant. Now she would use that very invisibility as her key. She would wrap herself in the identity he despised, the uniform he saw as a mark of inferiority, and she would use it as a Trojan horse to ride right into the heart of his fortress. The process was surprisingly, almost worryingly easy. She submitted an application to the catering company online, using a slightly altered version of her name and relying on her verifiable, glowing employment record from Aurelia, a record that existed right up until the moment she was unceremoniously fired. She received a call the next day. They were desperate for experienced staff for the Croft Gala. There was no extensive background check, only a brief phone interview to confirm her qualifications. She was hired. A few days later, a crisp, black uniform arrived in a box, almost identical to the one she had worn at Aurelia. As she held it up, the familiar, starched fabric felt different in her hands. This was not the shroud of a fallen academic, a symbol of her compromised life. This was armor. It was a disguise, a costume for the final act of a play that had been years in the writing. Every element of her past, the scientific mind that could analyze a problem and the service professional who could navigate a room unnoticed, was converging for this one night. She was no longer just Ilara Vance the waitress or Ilara Vance the toxicologist. She was both a perfect synthesis of her two worlds, poised to deliver a righteous and devastating justice. The night of the gala arrived, a swirl of flashing camera bulbs and the low hum of expensive cars arriving at the grand entrance of the city's most prestigious ballroom. Ilara entered not through the red-carpeted front doors, but through the clattering, steam-filled chaos of the industrial kitchen in the basement. The air was thick with the smells of searing scallops and melted chocolate, a world away from the delicate perfumes of the guests upstairs. She moved through the pre-event briefing in a focused daze, her mind a calm island in the storm of activity around her. She was assigned to serve champagne during the cocktail hour, a role that would give her perfect mobility and access to the entire ballroom. As she took her position carrying a tray of flutes filled with bubbling golden liquid, she saw him. Julian Croft was holding court near the stage, surrounded by a fawning circle of politicians and socialites. He was radiant, basking in the glow of their adoration, a king in his castle, utterly oblivious to the ghost from his past who was gliding silently through the crowd, just a few feet away. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, wild rhythm against the calm, professional facade she projected. Her hands, however, were perfectly steady as she offered glasses of champagne to the city's elite, her face a mask of pleasant neutrality. She was invisible again, a functional part of the luxurious scenery, and she reveled in it. She watched Croft laugh, a booming, artificial sound that didn't reach his cold eyes. She watched him accept accolades for his supposed generosity, his face a perfect picture of humble. The grand ballroom of the city center was a universe unto itself, a breathtaking galaxy of shimmering gowns and tailored tuxedos, all orbiting the gravitational center of Julian Croft. Ilara moved through this world, on a familiar current of invisibility, a tray of champagne flutes held aloft like a shield. The air was a complex chemical cocktail of 1,000 different expensive perfumes, the rich aroma of catered delicacies, and the underlying, metallic scent of ambition. Each face she passed was a study in practiced ease, the relaxed smiles of men and women who measured their worth in stock portfolios and summer homes. Her heart was a frantic, wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs, but her outward demeanor was a placid lake of professional calm. She saw Croft, a sun king in his court, accepting praise with a performance of magnanimity that was physically nauseating to her. He would occasionally glance in her direction, his eyes sliding right over her uniform, seeing not a person but a function, an object. This blindness, once a source of deep humiliation, was now her greatest weapon. She was a ghost at the feast, a silent, patient predator, and the entire, glittering affair was a beautifully constructed trap, set to spring upon its unsuspecting host. The moment arrived with a flourish of orchestrated applause. The mayor of the city, A man whose campaign had been generously funded by Croft Global stood at the podium, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system as he delivered a glowing panegyric to the man of the hour. He spoke of Croft's unparalleled vision, his civic leadership, his profound generosity. With each laudatory phrase, Elara felt a cold, hard knot tighten in her stomach. She thought of the paltry settlement offered to the families poisoned by the Northgate plant, a fraction of the cost of the chandeliers hanging above their heads. She thought of her father, his brilliant mind silenced, his care funded by the tips she earned serving men like these. Julian Croft finally ascended the stage, bathed in a warm, golden spotlight, the very picture of philanthropic grace. He accepted the heavy crystal award for Philanthropist of the Year and began his speech, his voice a smooth, confident baritone. He spoke of responsibility, of giving back, of building a better future. As he uttered the words, "It is our duty to lift up those who have fallen," the image of her father's slumped form in his wheelchair burned behind Elara's eyes with the intensity of a magnesium fire. The speech concluded, and the room erupted in a standing ovation. A moderator stepped to the podium to announce a brief, pre-screened question-and-answer session. This was her moment. The window of opportunity was impossibly small, a fleeting gap in the carefully managed proceedings. Leaving her tray on a nearby stand, Elara began to move. It was not a rush, but a deliberate, inexorable glide through the crowd. Every instinct screamed at her to stop, to retreat into the safety of her invisibility, but she pushed through the wall of her own fear, her movements fueled by a decade of suppressed rage and a lifetime of love for her father. She reached the aisle microphone, a slender silver stalk standing alone in the vast, carpeted expanse. As she stepped up to it, a few heads turned, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and mild annoyance. The moderator, seeing her uniform, began to wave her away, a dismissive flick of the wrist. "Ma'am, this is for guests only," he said, his voice laced with condescension. But Elara was already looking past him, her gaze fixed directly on the man on the stage. Julian Croft's eyes met hers, a flicker of irritation crossing his face at the unseemly interruption. But there was no recognition. To him, she was just another faceless servant out of her place. Her voice when she spoke did not tremble. It was calm, clear, and carried a resonant authority that seemed to come from a place deep within her, a voice she hadn't used in years. It cut through the polite chatter of the room, silencing it instantly. "Mr. Croft," she began, the words precise and cold as ice. "My name is Elara Vance." She paused, letting her name hang in the opulent air. On the stage, Croft's practiced smile remained frozen, but a subtle tightening around his eyes betrayed his impatience. Elara continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "You wouldn't know my name, but you knew my father's, Henry Vance." At the mention of that name, the mask of benevolent philanthropy on Julian Croft's face finally, irrevocably, cracked. A flicker of something ancient and ugly, a memory he had long since buried, surfaced in his eyes. The color began to drain from his face. The room, which had been merely quiet, was now gripped by a sudden electric tension. Every person in the audience was now staring, no longer at the billionaire on the stage, but at the unknown waitress who had just thrown a grenade into the heart of the proceedings. She had his attention now, she had everyone's attention. "My father," Elara continued, her voice a steady, powerful indictment, "was the chief chemical engineer at Northgate Chemical, a company you acquired and then gutted for profit. He was the man who discovered your company was illegally dumping carcinogenic waste into the local water supply, poisoning families to save a few dollars on your balance sheet. He was the man you tried to silence." A wave of murmurs swept through the ballroom. On stage, Croft was no longer smiling. His face was a thunderous mask of rage and disbelief. He made a sharp, cutting gesture to the security guards positioned at the side of the stage, his silent command to remove her clear and urgent. But it was too late. The story was out. "You framed him," Alara declared, her voice ringing with the clarity of absolute truth. "You ruined his career, destroyed his health, and left him a prisoner in his own body. And tonight, you accept an award for your charity, a charity that exists to put a compassionate face on the suffering that men like you create." She looked toward the back of the room, where Alistair Finch, posing as a journalist, gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod to a man in the audio-visual booth. "You have spent years hiding behind your lawyers and your public relations team," Alara said, her eyes locking with Croft's. "But you can't hide from your own voice." And then it began. Not with a warning, but with a sudden, jarring burst of sound that hijacked the ballroom's perfect acoustics. It was the hiss of a cheap digital recorder, amplified 1,000 times, followed by the unmistakable, confident voice of Julian Croft, echoing from every speaker in the room. The sound was tinny, ghostly, a voice from a decade ago speaking his damnation into the present. The audience was frozen, their faces a gallery of shock and horror. They heard him giving the direct order to falsify the environmental reports. They heard him callously plotting the smear campaign against Henry Vance, his words dripping with a cold sociopathic pragmatism. They heard him laugh as he said, "Handle the Henry Vance problem by any means necessary." On the stage, Julian Croft was a man imploding in real time. His face contorted into a mask of pure, primal rage. He lunged for the microphone on his podium, shouting, "Lies! It's a fake! Shut it off!" But his own recorded voice drowned him out, a relentless, damning chorus. The security guards started to move toward Alara, but they were blocked by a sudden surge of reporters from the press section, their cameras flashing like a violent electrical storm. A frenzy of digital vultures descending to capture the spectacular death of a titan. The recording ended, plunging the ballroom into a stunning, profound silence that lasted for 3 full heartbeats. Then, chaos erupted. The carefully maintained facade of civilized opulence shattered into a million pieces. The city's elite, the very people who had been applauding him moments before, now stared at Croft with expressions of open disgust and horror. Shouts and accusations echoed through the hall as people scrambled for the exits, distancing themselves from the toxic fallout of his exposure. Julian Croft stood alone on the stage, the golden spotlight now a harsh, interrogating beam. His face was a grotesque canvas of sweat and disbelief, his tailored suit suddenly looking like the costume of a fool. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. In that one perfectly executed moment, Alara had done more than just expose his crimes. She had annihilated his identity. She had stripped him of his power, his reputation, and his most cherished possession, the illusion of his own virtue. He was no longer a philanthropist or a captain of industry. He was just a criminal, unmasked in his own temple, brought down not by an army or a rival corporation, but by the quiet, relentless courage of a woman he had never even bothered to see. What was the most satisfying moment of Julian Croft's downfall for you? Let us know in the comments. Type "justice" in the comments if you got chills when Alara finally exposed the truth. How did that final confrontation make you feel? Share your reaction with us below. In the weeks and months that followed, the Croft empire crumbled with astonishing speed. The audio recording was a catalyst that ignited a firestorm of legal and financial consequences. Federal investigators, armed with the irrefutable evidence from her father's files and Marcus Thorne's testimony, launched a massive criminal probe into Croft Global Industries. The company's stock plummeted into oblivion, and its board of directors, desperate to save themselves, forced Croft to resign in disgrace. He was arrested, his perp walk broadcast on every news channel, the image of the once invincible billionaire in handcuffs becoming a symbol of a stunning reversal of fortune. The legal battles were brutal, but the evidence was overwhelming. He was found guilty on multiple counts of corporate fraud, perjury, and environmental crimes, sentenced to a lengthy prison term that ensured he would never again walk the halls of power. His fortune was decimated by lawsuits from the poisoned families of Northgate and penalties from the SEC. He had lost everything, not in a hostile takeover, but in a public reckoning that he had authored with his own arrogance. Ilara did not watch the trial from the courtroom. She followed it from the quiet, dignified office of her new life. A few days after the gala, she had received a call from a woman named Eleanor Hayes, the CEO of a rival, ethically driven investment firm. Hayes had been in the audience that night, and she had been profoundly moved not only by Ilara's courage, but by the sharp, strategic mind that had engineered Croft's downfall. She saw past the waitress uniform to the brilliant toxicologist and master strategist beneath. She didn't offer Ilara sympathy, she offered her a challenge. She offered her the position of director of a newly created corporate ethics and accountability division, a role where Ilara could use her unique skills and experiences to analyze potential acquisitions, not just for financial viability, but for moral and ethical integrity. It was a chance to become a gatekeeper, to prevent future Julian Crofts from ever rising to power. Ilara accepted, stepping back into the world that had been stolen from her, not as a victim, but as a protector. The final scene of this long, painful chapter unfolded not in a grand ballroom or a sterile courtroom, but in the quiet, sunlit room of her father's care facility. Ilara, dressed in a sharp, professional suit that was her new uniform, sat beside his wheelchair. She held a tablet, the screen showing the headline of a major news publication: Julian Croft, sentenced to 25 years in landmark corporate crime case. She read the article aloud, her voice steady and clear, describing the verdict, the triumph of justice, the final, undeniable validation of his sacrifice. Her father could not speak, he could not applaud, but as she finished reading, he slowly turned his head to look at her. His eyes, for so long clouded by a fog of frustration and helplessness, were perfectly, luminously clear. A single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek. He reached out with a trembling hand and squeezed her fingers, a small, simple gesture that contained a universe of love, pride, and profound gratitude. In that quiet, shared moment, the full circle of their journey was complete. Justice had been served, his honor had been restored, and his legacy was now safe in the hands of the daughter he had taught to believe in the unshakable, elemental power of truth. If Ilara Vance's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell. If you believe that courage and truth can change the world, help us spread that message by giving this video a like and sending it to a friend. To make sure you don't miss our next story of righteous revenge, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell.